Hello and welcome to Chapter 13 of the Modern Mindset Podcast. I'm your host, Mahfouz Chowdhury. I'm here with my incredible host, Camille, and we're excited to welcome you back for yet another incredible episode as we're inching down the double digits that we've been laying out over the last few weeks. I always need to say this at the beginning because I suck at promoting our own podcast show and I end up saying it in the last minute of our episode. So let me just throw it out there. My friends, if you are getting any value from any of our past 12 episodes or the one that you're listening to right now, and even an ounce of value that you can add to your life, I encourage you to like and subscribe to our podcast platform. If you're watching it on video on YouTube, hit the like button, hit the subscribe button so that you get notified every time we go live, just like we are doing a live recording right now. And if you're listening to it on an audio platform, you also have the ability to subscribe or follow the account. So I do encourage you on your audio platform to go ahead and hit subscribe. So once again, you get notified every single time the episode goes out. This was a fun conversation today that I'm kind of excited about, Camille, and it's one that I think we were about to do last week, but through back and forth, you and I kind of decided that hey, maybe self-talk needs to be the laser focus today. But I knew without a shadow of a doubt that this was the ideal topic to break out today because it kind of leads into the next part that I think we did a very heavy job on really dissecting over the last episode, which today's conversation is specifically about better courage. And the word courage to me, I don't know about you, Camille, but when I think of the word courage, I instantly think of that lion, that courage lion on, gosh, what is it? What am I thinking of here? Help me out.
Oh my God, I remember the character's name
Alice
was
in
Dorothy.
Wonderland, right?
Yeah.
Alice in Wonderland, yes. I hope I'm thinking of it. If not, our
God.
our listeners will very
Oh my
rudely
God.
give me awakening. I'm gonna Google that in a second. But the courage line, right? And the fact that he's a scary cat in the beginning. He's a wuss, and the irony is he's also the lion. And you kind of think about what that looks like from a courage standpoint. But what I really want to do a good job today is defining the word courage a little bit better. But Camille, I'd love for you to give a little bit of a maybe an introduction to what this topic means to you. You get full credit for introducing this theme into today's chapter, which I'm a big fan of. But I'd love to get your thoughts around what courage means to you and what you hope that we spend today's episode kind of dissecting in real time today.
Thank you. For me, courage is, obviously about being brave. And I guess we can further break that down into actually being able to trust yourself in the situation that you're going to go into without knowing what's going to happen. And what that means is at least not running away from it and actually allowing yourself to experience it and to do it, I guess, in the best way possible, which would be just to actually be authentic and not worry about what's going on afterwards. I think for me it's been a very important topic because at the cornerstone of pretty much everything about personal development is that section. There's also the work component on it and like the things you can do at home in your own comfortable safe space, but the real work and real change I feel happens when you apply that outside, and when you get challenged you actually have to feel those feelings that you've been trying to kind of manage and rewire your expectations around and your thoughts around so you can actually move forward in the way you want. It's hard when you actually have that stimulus there and then you get reverted back to like old thought patterns and old beliefs and old behaviors, and you have to like almost like do all the work on the spot once again to do that. And I think courage is the first step you have to take if you really want to make a change. So for me, that's why it's a very important topic.
That's great, Camille. And just for the record, I'm super embarrassed to admit that the show I was referring to was The Wizard of Oz,
Oh my
not
God.
Alice in Wonderland.
No,
And
that's
I
the
actually
same.
had to Google it, so I'm extra embarrassed about it. But yes, I fact checked myself. You see that? I don't even wait for others. I just know when I'm wrong here, and here it is.
I was gonna say the same thing too, which is the worst part too. Wizard
Yeah,
of Oz. I feel terrible, but oh well.
yeah. But you kind of what you exemplified there is really important. It's those opportunities that you get in life to really either take that leap forward or be pulled many steps behind. And I think that when you think of courage, sometimes the visual that comes to mind, outside of the cowardly lion that we just talked about, is kind of like you think of what you see in movies and TV shows, and sometimes the word courage gets associated with like that superhero moment, the danger moment, the life or death moment, and we almost think like that doesn't happen enough in our life to make us feel like we need to be courageous. But the courageous component comes in a lot of micro moments that really allows you to either accelerate or not. I talked about this briefly in the last chapter, and I pushed the idea of legacy, and I believe this was 2 chapters ago actually. And I talked about how sometimes a lot of the decisions that I've had to make in my life were not favorable, and when they're not favorable, you're often pushed against pressure by either the individuals that you love and trust the most, or the ones that you know that you're really letting down as a result of taking the alternative path. And in those moments, I feel like courage is the ingredient that will either allow you to progress ahead or cave. And as we call it frequently in the show, settling, settling for what you have. And as a result of that, you don't proceed ahead. It's not easy, man. I think about the word courage, and my mind frequently goes back to situations where the whole world is kind of rooting on a decision that you made, and then you almost have to go back and saying, hey, I'm going against that, knowing that you're kind of letting a lot of people down. And the risk that you're taking is maybe that the fact that your relationship with those people will never remain the same again. But what you start realizing sometimes is that the risk that you're taking, the purpose of that risk and what you're trying to achieve exceeds far more than the concern of whether someone is going to continue rooting for you or not. And even more so, sometimes showing their true colors. Like if they really loved you and really believed in you, they would root for you regardless of the fact that you had to make that decision. And when I think about real life scenarios where that happened, my mind first instantly drifts back to when I was flunking school. When I was flunking university and I was getting put on academic probation, it was very tough for me to know that I had to face my parents and let them know that. It was very tough for me to let my friends know, like, hey, by the way, I'm not coming to class with you guys anymore. Go on without me. And it was very tough for me to kind of go back to work. And when everyone's kind of asking you, like, hey, how's school going? When are you graduating? And I'm working in this like coffee shop, letting them know that I'm probably going to be in this coffee shop for a very long time because things haven't worked out. In those critical moments, it's the moment where you have the opportunity to either strike or settle. And I think it's very, very important to know the difference. I actually picked up a new book that I'm working on. And I like that this podcast actually gives me an opportunity to kind of open up about things that I'm reading at the moment, because it also lets me give recommendations to books at the same time. And admittedly, I'm just at the very beginning of this book, but the book is called From Good to Great, and it's by a well-known author, Jim Collins. And I finally decided to pick up this book as it was recommended to me by many successful business owners and also many people that I know personally. And I finally said, you know what? If these guys are recommending it, I need to at least know what the book is about. So I went ahead and picked it up, and I'm in the very early stage. I believe I'm only on the 3rd chapter, but the book did such a fascinating job at the very beginning, identifying the difference between good to great. And we talk a lot about good. And the way that good was defined was that when you think about a society where if the education facilities are good, they're not going to make the attempt to become great. If you think about the government not being great, it's because it's good enough. And we think a lot about how us as individuals actually use that as our metric, saying, hey, things are good. There's no reason for me to try to make it better. Things are fine, so I'm okay with how things are. And in many ways, I bring that to the definition of what I think settling is. You're settling with the fact that things are good when things could have been better, which in many ways is the underlying theme of our entire show, right? Season 1 is all about you can do better. And I thought this book had a definite correlation between that. And this book went on to really describe this study in heavy detail. And the best that I can do in a few minutes that I can explain it is the fact that they set up a metric of what great means by definition. And they went to Fortune 500 companies, and they found that there's only 11 companies in that Fortune 500 that actually qualified based on the definition of great. Because what they wanted great to be wasn't the fact that they just happened to be a great business, is the fact that they were doing okay, they were doing under industry average, and then they progressed ahead. And also businesses that have been in business for a long time. So they've been stable for a very long time. So imagine like for 10 years straight, you're the same person. But then one day, all of a sudden, you just had this massive leap. There's something that happened in that year. So they spent that as the rubric to kind of go and assess like what are these 11 businesses doing that allowed them to go from good to actually great. And in many ways, they were highlighting the underdogs, right? The underdogs that weren't the winners in their industry, but somehow struck and far exceeded what a winner in the industry could have been like. And it was quite fascinating to me, Camille, because one of the examples that it talked about was what, you have to kind of look at the ones that aren't succeeding just as much as you look at the ones who are succeeding, right? And the example that they used was an Olympian. If you're trying to figure out what makes a gold winner Olympian, and if you spend all your time just looking at it, the gold medal winners, you might have come back and just said, okay, so there's a correlation that if you have a trainer, you win a gold medal. But the truth is, if you looked at all the losers in the same competition, you would find that they also had trainers. So you can't use the metric that trainers equals gold medal. You have to find that unique element between what the winners are doing and what the others aren't doing. And this is kind of where I want to start the conversation before I talk a little bit more about the book, because I can really talk about the first three chapters all day. There's so much to say about it. But when you look at the comparison, Camille, the gold medal versus the non-gold medal, and in this story, the ones that are courageous, in examples like mine, where you're kind of faced against the popularity, you're faced against a popular decision, and a lot of people are kind of rooting for you. There's some people in the world that's going to take that leap of faith and do it anyways, and there's some people that will cave and, as we say, settle. What do you think might be the missing piece between, if we did a study, what do you think might be the missing piece between the ones that have actually built the courage to do something about it versus the ones that actually cave and kind of settle and allow the good to be their metric rather than trying to become great?
Fear, probably. Fear of losing that. And also, I think just not carrying the belief that there's a possibility of improvement. I think for like a lot of things I went through, I used to always think that, this is the way it's supposed to be. This is the way it is. Things can't get better. They can always get worse, but they can't be better. And maybe I'm asking too much, or I'm not good enough and I don't deserve better. I think the huge thing, the two main ones are belief and fear. And for a lot of people too, we've been conditioned to believe certain things are possible, and there are certain things that are impossible. And the more and more we think about it too, if we don't see other people achieving what we would deem as impossible, then it's forever going to be seen as unattainable by anyone, let alone by ourselves, which we would naturally assume that we're worse off than the overachievers that we see out there getting it. So I think that has a huge role to play, and I remember in my own life too. It's I never would have thought that I would have been good at science at all, or good at medicine. I always thought that I was pretty decent at math, so I can be logical, but to be good at school, I was no I never had that drive to be that good until I started trying. And I guess putting myself out there, and actually, when I mean putting myself out there, it was actually putting myself to work and to suffer through that. And because, the courage there for me was, I didn't try, so it doesn't matter if I failed, because I didn't try. So I have nothing to lose. But imagine if I tried and I failed, that would have been a huge scar on me. I would have been so ashamed that I'm not good enough, that I have a piece of paper telling me that I have even a defined percentage of how worthy I am. So when I finally allowed myself to work hard and to actually take that step forward, then I was able to see that I'm more capable than I thought. And I think that's what a lot of people see as well, or they don't see. I know that in a lot of marriages, for instance, a lot of the guys I talk to just are like, this is the way it is, where I have to kind of I had to sleep on the couch if I do something wrong. It's like, do you? Like, when was that ever a condition? It's just like, it's just so expected because we hear that over and over. But, like, the fear is if I bring up what I'm actually concerned about, then I fear getting her upset, or I fear getting even worse punishment. But you could also, like, you could also become closer by bringing up those issues. And in fact, I don't see what's the point. Why not try for something better? And I mean, yeah, the worst thing that can happen is if you fail and if you lose it. But I mean, for the most part, and at least in relationships, if you fail by being more of yourself, then was that a relationship to begin with? Or is that a relationship where you want, where you're just constantly putting up an act? So I think those two things are the main ones, and I'm pretty sure you have some very good ideas about this too.
I love the extremities that you drew out between the belief and the fear. And I think you absolutely nailed it, right? On the belief side, we talked very much about the importance of having a strong why and a strong purpose. And I think a lot of those decisions that are sometimes made are really dependent on if your purpose is strong enough, right? If it's strong enough of what you want to really achieve, you're going to be able to overcome a lot of the challenges, because all you see these challenges are as is minor roadblocks or little obstacles that you got to figure out how to navigate through it. And with our generation being able to find solutions to problems better than we've ever had through search friendly tools, is if you really have a purpose that big, you don't get crippled by these obstacles. You're just finding a way around it, and it just looks like one other step you got to figure out. It's kind of like when you walk up the steps, right? Walking up the steps, you just know you got to lift up your feet a little bit higher every time to get up to the top. You're not stopping and debating over, like, man, I don't want to do this one again, or man, this is not something I want to climb over. You're just getting it done. And I think when your purpose is strong enough, these obstacles just start looking like steps that you got to climb over. Now, some of them may be a little bit taller than the others, but you're still very well aware that you can build it, or you can find tools like a ladder to climb over it. So I think the purpose is a big one. But I think the more common one, as you have highlighted, is on the fear side. And I would definitely say on my side, the fear side is probably a bigger one that I've had to challenge when it comes to the theme of courage and whether or not I could overcome it. And I think based on what I've seen over and over in my life, not only through myself, but conversations with others, I really think that the stories we tell in our head around fear is far more exaggerated than the case tends to really be. You think about this with sometimes jobs, right? Like, I sometimes hear people complain about the job that they have. And they know with every fiber in their body that the solution is to get a better job, right? Instead of trying to complain to, not only are they complaining, they're complaining to people that aren't even in the company. So now they're complaining to people that can't even fix their problem. But the fear of, hey, I need to start over, or I need to be in a new environment, or if I leave now and don't even get a job, how am I going to pay my bills? They tell themselves these stories that prevents them from doing what they know the answer is. And even when they're doing it, such as applying for a job, you can tell how badly they actually want out of the job based on how aggressively they're applying, right? There's people that I know that have been complaining for years and are still working the same job. There's people that I know that are applying, but they're maybe applying once or twice a month. And you think about all those, the root reason of why that happens, you realize it's out of certain fears. Some of the people are scared to get rejected by another job. Some people are scared to leave their current job because they got comfortable. Some get scared because they might have made one friend in the office and they don't want to leave that friend now. And it's all those little elements start playing a big role. But when you think about it, you can leave that job, you can get another job, and if you don't like the new job, you can just leave that and find another crappy job, right? Like, you can always come back. It doesn't cripple you to a point where you're completely down and out. You just think about how many stories we tell ourselves that makes us freeze up from making decisions that are nowhere near as severe as we think that they are. And now take that example that I gave you and apply that to every part of your life. You think about relationships and how many situations that people are in relationships that they're not happy in. The example of being put out in the couch and maybe being in a situation where that is just the least of the problems. Maybe there's far more things happening, but then you have the fear in your head that maybe I won't find someone else, or maybe someone might be worse, or maybe this person will get better over time, right? You get hopeful, and you start using those to feed yourself false stories that will eventually make you become a believer and make you become crippled to change, and then make you throw away the ability of being courageous and making a decision. And these are on situations where fear is actually surpassing your level of unhappiness. And I think that's what it really comes down to is when you find out that the unhappiness exceeds the level of fear, you're going to take action and you're going to do something about it. And I think that that's a big conversation piece that needs to happen. That I'm pretty blunt about people that complain about their jobs, because if I find out they haven't applied, I just tell them that you don't hate it bad enough, right? You don't hate it bad enough, and you're complaining about it without doing anything about it. Why? And I have yet to find a good reason. I've given every single one of them an opportunity to tell me why they're not applying aggressively, and I've yet to find a good reason of why they haven't. So I believe that to be so true. But this was the same case from my perspective as well, Camille. Like I can't say that this was always an easy thing for me to do. And I can't always say that I stopped to tell myself I need to be courageous in order to do it. There's a well known book by Susan Jeffers called Feel the Fear and Do It Anyways. And the entire book is about helping you manage your fear. But let's just talk about what the title itself means, which is her ultimate takeaway is you're going to feel fear. That's a normal feeling. First of all, feel good knowing that everyone feels that same feeling, right? Because sometimes you think it's unique to you and that you're the wuss because you're feeling it when no one else is talking about it. But feel good knowing that everyone feels that same fear. But the doing it anyway component is the difference between those gold medal winners and not the gold medal winners. And if you even want to take it literally, just think about how many people don't end up going to the Olympics out of that exact same fear. The fear of not winning, the fear of failing, the fear of disappointing, the fear of being on television and not looking like the champion. Like all those fears cripple you from the fact that you could have been an Olympian athlete, right? Like that story to me, I think is such a big piece. So I love the way you laid out the extremities, and I 100% agree that I think it's between those two battles, that tug of war between do you want it bad enough as a purpose, and does your unhappiness surpass your fear that will allow you to get out of it? And I think if you can manage those emotional levels, it will really help you get out of it. And maybe that's a great thing to dive into next is how do you manage those emotional levels? Like if you're on the side where you've maybe, and excuse me for the poor way of putting this, but if you wuss out on situations that you could have come out on the winning side, what could you do differently next time? Like how do you prepare yourself to manage that emotion that will allow you to not wuss out the next time?
I want to say that like I like dealt with fear and anxiety a lot, and I'm not perfect either. For sure, there are certain situations where I don't perform well, and I let the fear go back, like bring me back, but like to old patterns because, like I've mentioned several times on the podcast, that I used to suffer through social anxiety a lot, and it was to the point where I had clinically diagnosed social phobia, and I would get panic attacks seemingly out of nowhere. And I think I told one of like the most random ones I've had where it was just me walking down the street in my own neighborhood, and I got a panic attack because I thought people were judging me. So the bigger triggers were, being around people and being groups, and especially around parties. And so there are specific strategies for things like those. And for other situations where you cannot employ those strategies, it's a little bit more tough. So I would say my mindset around that was it depends on how aroused and stimulated I was, like around the fear. If it's too much to a point where I can't function, then I had to deal with it somehow. And breathing exercises and meditation were huge for that. If it was, one of the biggest things about anxiety in general is the time leading up to the event. It's always the anticipation that makes it worse. Once you're thrown into the situation, it is scary, but it isn't as scary as before when you're expecting it. So sometimes a nice thing for me, like especially when I was in school, and the teacher would ask a question, was just to throw my hand up. like instantly without thinking, and I made it my goal for the day. My goal was to put my hand up, and even if I didn't have a good question, just think of something. I would summarize what the teacher said and then try to think of a question that maybe I even knew the answer to. But the point was to just go for it and make the goal as small as possible that's achievable, despite the fact that I'm afraid. I'm trying to give a very good example of what actually helped me a lot when it came to terms with being more courageous around these events that I had the build up for, and what it
Yeah.
was acknowledging that it's there, and saying that when you feel feelings like that, there it's never just one feeling, almost never. So if you pay attention to yourself, you can try to find other feelings, because nervousness also has excitement to it. So you can usually find the opposite of that emotion, and then if you try to like feel both at the same time, that kind of separates yourself from the emotion. And another thing, a good like self-talk technique is also just, instead of saying like I am nervous, I am feeling nervous, or my mind is telling me that I'm feeling nervous. Even that alone is just enough separation between that emotion so you don't get overwhelmed by it. And then actually like listening to your body and feeling the physical sensations of it does help. It helps with creating that separation, also that noticing of these other emotions. I'd say, like, as a general rule of thumb, what I do for situations that I'm scared of is the breathing, is the meditation, and like trying to notice the feeling and trying to find the opposite, or trying to find what else I feel and try to separate myself from both and trying to feel both. But also like there are things like body posture. Like I try to stand up more straight and have my shoulders back and actually retract my scapula, which are shoulder blades, back and down, and try to like have my head up and make more eye contact. So kind of overcompensate for that fear does help a lot, in the sense that you're just putting yourself out there. I think as well, what I used to do is, when, especially in the beginning, reward myself for at least surviving that situation, as I would say, because sometimes it even felt that way. But also recognize like the benefits from it too, because like I can be proud of myself for, despite being this afraid of going and putting myself out there, and also every time that I do that, it makes the fear less. And even though it doesn't technically, it builds me up even more. So it doesn't make the fear less. Instead, I'm greater. I'm more capable to take it on, and I build up. So if it happens again, which it naturally will, it'll be easier. So every time you do that, it becomes easier. Never is easy, but those are like some general techniques I have, and we can go into more specifics as well. But I'm wondering if you do the same.
This is why I really believe that this chapter is a perfect bridge to what we talked about in the last one, because last one was all about self-talk, and even hearing you say the word self-talk made me realize how important that part is with what we're talking about today. But that self-talk component is a really big deal. We also talked about the cannonball analogy in the last episode, which very much ties in with kind of that feel the fear but do it anyways. And as you said, that the fear doesn't necessarily go away the next day when you do it again, but there's a certain level of confidence that comes with the fact that you didn't die when you cannonballed last time, that you're completely safe, and the fact that you had fun. And what that looks like is a different narration that takes place in your head. And this is something that I've had to deal with a lot in my career with speaking on stage, because in the speaking on stage component, it's that mental warfare that I have every single time that I walk into a venue about to speak on stage. And the conversations have changed over the years. You know, a decade ago, the conversations where my voice pleading, begging, and sometimes making great cases for why I should cancel the event, and trying to really tell me that it's not worth doing, because I was still a naive individual that wasn't sure, that had maybe an ounce of doubt that maybe I'll bomb on stage. and maybe I won't do great, and maybe I will go viral on the internet as someone that really messed up. And I used to get that kind of conversation in my head. But after I cannonballed, meaning did that event so many times, although I still get that feeling, that uneasy feeling of fear that creeps up on me, the conversation is different this time. This is a little bit scary, but you've done this in the past, and usually, if not almost always, you get tons of messages right after from the audience members that tell you that they got tons of value from it. And also the fact that you know your shit. You know your shit so well that you've been explaining it for the last 12 years. You'll be just fine. And that's the conversation I have instead, which leads me to having a better relationship with myself and a better feeling when I get up on stage. It doesn't feel like someone punched me in the gut by the time I get on stage. It's more like let's get this part of the talk out of the way that unleashes and releases that tension that I usually come on stage with. And that part has changed significantly over the years through exactly what you said, which is practice. But there's another important thing I want to throw into the ring, Camille, because you actually do this a lot, but you didn't mention it in your answer, which is you thoroughly research whatever it is that you're about to get into. And that part is super important. Like you actually look up information and you know what other people's experience was like, and then you take that leap. And that's something that I wanted to throw in here because it's a big part of the fact that you don't need to necessarily jump off a cliff without knowing whether or not you're going to survive. You can read that other people jumped off the cliff and said, hey, maybe hold on to a second parachute, or hey, maybe do it with a friend because it helps, or hey, maybe leap in a specific direction and a different pose. You know, in that analogy, that thing applies to everything that you're about to get into. You can look up whether it is on the internet, whether it is about speaking with people that have done it in the past, whether it is about surrounding yourself with the community that is constantly pouring stories about their experiences. What you're going to find is that it's easier to take that leap knowing that there's case studies of other people that have been able to do it very, very successfully and came out better. You know, you think about how many people have to do this in their career where they realize one day that what they went to school for or the job that they have is not actually what gets them excited anymore, and something else has caught their eye. When you can read a plethora of stories of people that made that same leap and are doing much better, it's a lot easier to take that leap than if no one in the history has ever talked about it. So I think that conversation is important and the research is important. You know, for a lot of the things that I took a leap in, I found myself frequently consulting you and some of our closest friends in order to get input. And it doesn't necessarily mean that you need to be someone that took that same experience. Sometimes I just trust that the outside perspective that you're giving me will arm me with maybe new information that I didn't think about. So I think it's worth thinking about that fear that you're battling with as something that can be looked into and dissected from other sources. And what that's going to allow you to do is bring that back to your self-talk, reminding yourself like, hey, Camille was able to do this. Or, hey, Camille said that his friend did something very similar. Maybe I should look into that. And what starts happening is you start feeling a little bit of a light, a beam of light of hope that starts pushing through that level of fear in your mind. And when that hope gets loud enough, either based on information or experience, you're now able to battle that fear a lot more. And sometimes the fear gets very, very minuscule. Although it can vary day to day, I really believe by feeding yourself that confidence through better self-talk will really prepare you to build the courage to take that leap that otherwise you might not have. And the beautiful thing is you don't need to be born with someone with courage. You don't need to be someone who always had courage. You might have been someone that even caved away when you had the opportunity to be courageous. The beautiful thing is you can turn that part on any given day that you realize that being able to achieve that change is far more important than where you are today. And by being able to make that mental shift, what you find that often happens is that your actions align very much with the mindset that you have on that day.
I very much agree with I guess the Buddhist kind of teachings and also like the Hindu ones, which is which is more about detachment from that, because I do agree that like researching a lot of things, especially when you can. Of course, when we're talking about things that you can research beforehand, it does help a lot. At least knowing whether or not it's worth taking the risk. Uh, However, I think looking for reassurance is more of a short term strategy than a long term one, just for the sense that some people do end up becoming reliant on reassurance, and then that doesn't really build their confidence up, and more or less they become reliable on, well, they rely on people to do the confidence building for them, or it becomes kind of like a drug to numb the fear a bit. And what I found to be more helpful for me in the past, well, in the past year since I discovered it, is the actual detachment from the outcome. Let's say, so if I'm going to do something like skydiving, the worst outcome is death. And actually, believe it or not, as morbid as it sounds, the best way for me to get courage was to say, if I die, so be it, because I could get reassurance that my friends have done it before. I know people that have and survived. So we can argue that maybe that's not reassurance. It's more battling the anxious thought, which is, holy shit, I'm gonna die. So it's like, that's a silly thought because all these other people have done it. They've lived. And you can also create like a kind of battle within yourself on top of the fear, which is anxiety, which will be, which gets kind of exhausting over a while. When I found, instead of creating that battle with yourself, which you can win a lot of the times, but it's very draining and very not really cost efficient, I would say, because like at the end of the day, after you battle your mind and you win, then you're tired, and then you're gonna have to do it again, because because that's just how your mind is. Your mind is very strong, and you also risk the chance of losing, which you can, and it's still worth trying to fight it. But for me, what I found even more effective than that is actually just saying, so be it. And the funny part is even when there's something at stake like death, and I'm not saying all the time, but there are some times, which is how crazy, when the anxious thoughts just stop, and it becomes very beautiful and seamless, where it's like, holy shit, I could die, and that's okay. And when that comes, and you feel this emotional kind of peace and strength, and sometimes you'll realize that, you know what, this risk is not worth it because I could die. But when you find that it's worth it for the other reasons, when you go take a look at your core values and realize that, you know what, this aligns with who I want to be and what I want, then it makes it a lot easier to carry it out, I find.
Your perspective is really, really interesting. And when you actually phrased it like you become you start relying on those success stories for the reason of like why you do things. It's an interesting perspective, and I think there's some part of that I do agree with. And I think it depends on the stage of the process that I go through, right? Because what you define, the so be it actually is very much a call out to the feel the fear and do it anyways. I think that's the exact same mindset actually. But what I kind of think of is like, where do I do that? Because I do that, but I'm thinking about where in the process. And there's part of me that's like, you do the research in preparation to go into that first, right? And I think of like, so even using skydiving as a literal example, you look up skydiving venues that are close by, and then how do you pick the best one? Probably based on like the ones that got the best review of like their experience with it, right? Like there's still some level of like you research it to make your judgment call, which I think from that standpoint is where the research happens. But I agree with you what you said there. I think the so be it component is interesting because there is, I believe, in any experience of battling through fear, there is a point of no return. And to me, a very simple version of point of no return that I actually use all the time is when people ask me how I stay consistent with going to the gym at 5 a.m. every morning, 5 or 6 a.m. every morning. I talk about the point of no return, which is I'm not actually trying to go get, I'm not actually aiming to get a workout. I'm aiming to get up those stairs on top of the second floor of the gym, because by the time I get there, there is no way in hell I'm going back down in my car and driving home and not doing a workout, right? That to me, that stairs is the point of no return for me. So I just try to get to the stairs. And that's actually a real mindset that I use all the time. And I think the point of no return, as someone who's also done skydiving, is the moment I've already leaped out of the plane and now I'm facing down and I have no choice. Like I can't fly back into the plane I jumped out of and I have no choice. So you get into that level of acceptance where the fear just evaporates. And I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, because this is a good think out loud moment that I'm having here, which is I believe every battle against fear has a point of no return. And I love it. If you do agree, I'd love it if you could actually give me a real example of scenarios where that happens. Because skydiving is a little extreme, right? Like for a lot of people will be like, oh, I can't relate to that. Like I'm gonna die and so be it, which is
Yeah.
horribly morbid. But you're right, that feeling does happen. Um, that does happen in the gym. So that's a good example. But what are some examples of scenarios that you felt point of no return that are maybe a little bit more relatable for the average person? What a day-to-day could look like, because I'm curious to see if we can stack this up with some real examples here.
Yeah, I feel like we could get very technical, and I think like as soon as we start pointing out examples, people are gonna be like, well, you can always have this exit strategy, but like I feel like even like I guess for everyone is taking a test at school, so once you actually sit in and have the test in front of you, that is the point of no return because you can't really escape. I mean, you can, but there's that. I think as well, any sort of when you're meeting someone for the first time and you made the introduction, that is the point of no return. You can always escape, but you've already kind of faced it. Same with going to a party. Once you step foot into the party, then you pretty much are there. And you can escape, but like again, once you get really technical, you can always
Yes.
argue that you
Yeah.
can escape.
So what you're saying there is actually a really important point too, which is as I used with the gym example, is like I could technically walk down the steps and get
Yeah.
back in the car. So when I say point of return as well, and it's worth defining, is it's not about whether you can literally go back and against your word, because you can. It's when you're at that point where it's easier to follow through with the commitment than it would have been to back out. So the point of real return is that, and what you actually mentioned to me strike up a really good example, because I think that happens quite frequently when you're trying to maybe approach and talk with someone that you're attracted to that you've never spoke to before, and you get all this jitters inside of you and you don't know how to strike up the conversation. But the moment you go up and you say something and that person has now looked at you and is waiting for you to finish your statement, you now, I believe, I hope you're now at that point of no return. I believe that's what you're trying to say as well, right?
Yeah, I think actually the way you define it is perfect, because it is essentially that you can always, well, not always, because again, skydiving is an extreme example, leave, but yeah, when it's about you're more likely to stay than you are to leave, just because it's easier or just because you're already in it, then I think that's a great definition. Yeah.
The one that has happened to me most recently that came to mind is Priya, my girlfriend, has recently invited me to visit her family for the first time. And I got to tell you, it was the one of the most anxieties I've ever felt in a long time. Like no podcast conversation, no stage presence, no client pitch, none of that stacks up against the nervousness that I felt as I was driving up to the driveway to meet her family for the first time. But there was something really funny that happened that I think I shared with you after, which is I was so nervous. Like I actually felt like I needed to pull out on the side of the road and just throw up into hopefully not the grass, not hopefully not their grass, but maybe the neighbor's grass,
Yeah.
But I was feeling sick to my stomach. And then I came out and I bought them a bouquet of flowers. I bought them some extra gifts. So I pick up the gifts. I walk up to the door, and just out of sheer habit, what do you do when you walk up to a door that's not yours? You ring the doorbell. And I walked up and I hit the doorbell and I was like, oh my God, I should have taken a second to get my thoughts together or taken a deep breath. I'm feeling sick and I just ran up and rang the doorbell. That to me, Camille, was the point of no return, because at that point, I either run and jump in my car and drive off as they're opening the door, or I follow through with the commitment.
Yeah.
And as much as I was like beating myself up for running up and hitting the doorbell without thinking about it, it was an incredible feeling because it didn't give me the opportunity to feel that fear anymore. And as you said, how did you phrase it? Just get it over with, I think is how
Yeah,
you
I
phrased
guess
it.
so. Well, yeah, survive it, but
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah, and just muscle through it. And then they opened the door, and instantly I just went into autopilot, and I couldn't be happier with how it went. So that fear was trying to take away what I knew would have been a great experience if I overcame it. And fortunately, the habit of pressing a doorbell ended up becoming the point of no return. So It's such an important piece, man. I'm really glad this came up even the way it did, because I it wasn't in the back of my mind as I was trying to define courage, but the point of no returns are super important, right? With a lot of areas of your life.
Absolutely, and that's a good thing that you brought up too, because when you think about it, if you can set one, it's easier to convince yourself, again, to your example, to walk up the steps of the gym than it is to do a workout. So it kind of takes away some of that that resistance to doing the task because you make it easier. And actually, that's a good technique a lot of authors use as well. I can't remember the specific author, but there was one that when he was done writing for the day, he would create a sentence, but like half of the sentence. So then the next day, when he starts again, he just has to finish that sentence, which is a lot easier than thinking of what to write next. And then once you have that momentum, then you just move on forward because it's easier. So if you can kind of set yourself like point of no returns, let's say, then it makes any kind of commitment that maybe you're worried about or that you find daunting or challenging a lot easier. And I also want to point out too that when we're talking about this, and you brought up the example of meeting Priya's parents for the first time. I also recently, like 2 weeks ago, I think 2 weeks ago now, met my girlfriend's friends for the first time, and this was the first time in 5 or 6 years where I actually felt my social anxiety almost to the same point of when I was like on medication and like working through it actively. And it was crazy to think that it's been that long and I'm this nervous, and my mind went to the same place as I was when I was that young. And so when I stepped in, the point of no return was we're walking down the hallway, and then like into like an open concept kitchen. And as soon as I set in, then everyone's there and everyone looks at me, and literally my mind went, "Holy fuck!" Like it stopped for a second, and like it was like, okay, now say hi, and I was like, oh, like hello everyone, whatever. And it was amazing. After that, it was like, okay, now I just have to now the anticipation's gone and now I'm in the moment. And now in the moment it's kind of like it's easier because then you have something to focus on besides your own thoughts. And unfortunately with me, since I'm kind of neurotic and my thoughts run pretty quick when it gets anxious. And unfortunately with anxious thoughts, it's not only quick thoughts but emotionally charged thoughts. So it's very hard to deal with in real time, especially when you're talking with people. But like I just remember meeting your friends, and I'm these people are gonna realize that like I'm a piece of shit. Like that actually crossed my mind. I'm like, when the hell have I ever thought about this, especially with strangers? Like it was amazing to have to like go through that once again. So uh, the whole point with courage is not to eliminate the fear. And in fact, like even thought patterns I had from 10 years ago that I've worked so hard on, they do happen. But upon working on yourself and like facing the fears over time and building more and more courage, it becomes easier to overcome and easier to survive the situations and to put yourself in them despite it. Like think about how much stronger it is the person that feels no fear or the person that feels fear and does it anyway. I think even that, just recognizing that, makes you more likely to chase it. So it's a huge mindset thing to have, and self-talk is super important.
I have a lot of things that I want to ask about the situation because there's a few areas to unpack here. I'm gonna just drop a couple questions because I'm thinking like
Okay.
five different things at the same time. And if you need me to repeat it, let me know because
Sure.
I think there's a lot here. One thing I was thinking about is you've used the word flow state in the past, right? And I was actually even asking myself last time you used it, I was like, what does that exactly mean? And I'd love for you to define it. Is the moment that you kind of went on autopilot, Camille, and started socializing with your friends, after that point of return, like would you almost say that the moment after the point of return is considered a flow state? And then my second question is, what do you think caused in that specific scenario for you to go back to like the Camille in the past and that way of thinking where you felt that level of anxiety? Like what do you think it was about this moment? Could it be that you were out of practice with meeting friends that of someone that you're dating? Like, could it be one of those things, or was it just maybe the circumstance that you were meeting under? I threw a lot at you. I'd love to see where you pick it up from there.
Okay, yeah. Yeah, so like with the flow state, I think like um with in that second where I switched off from, thinking about like holy shit this is going to happen and what do I do? And trying to manage those feelings and expectations and then onto like, oh, I have to socialize, I have to say hi. Like in that second it was, but then because I wasn't fluent with the micros, meaning like, when I say micros, I make it sound so specific, but it's literally, taking steps and walking to people and handshaking. Like I had to actually think, do this, because my mind was fighting me the whole time. It's like run away, and I was like, no, why are you taking a step for? Why are you shaking this person's hand? Like, what are you doing? Run right now, like because of that, I guess I wasn't in the flow state, but that little second I was because it wasn't because as even though I said say hi, it was just natural. Like I saw everyone saw me, and I was like, big hello, hi, how everyone's doing, kind of thing. And I think to me, like flow state is when you don't have those thoughts circling around your head, telling yourself you have to do this. This is the next step. It's almost like second nature. It almost becomes breathing, where you don't even think about it, or driving, where you don't even realize that you've like gotten to your destination. You're like, how did I get there?
Yeah,
That's what I would say.
quickly on that one. We talked about, we used the word vibing in the past, right? We were kind of
Yeah.
like, hey, when you see two people and they're vibing, is that the same thing in based on your definition? When two people are vibing, that be like they're in flow state, or is that, would you say there's a difference between those two?
No, I would agree completely with that. Like if you see like two people vibing and they're like, holy shit, like, you and I have had like hour-long conversations where like, oh my God, I had no idea all this time went by. I think that would also be the flow state where we're just like not even thinking about what to say next, whatever, it just naturally goes and flows, you know? So yeah.
Got it, got it. And so, what about the other question?
All
What made
right.
you look back to old Camille, and what do you think it was about that specific moment? Because you're right, like the truth is, you could feel like you got this down packed, and then you're like, oh my god, it's happening again. And sometimes that cripples people because it makes them think like, oh, I haven't worked on my stuff at all. I'm just still that same person, a coward that I used to be. So, what made you kick back to that specific moment versus maybe other things that could have done that as well?
I have to say the expectation and how much I badly wanted to control the outcome, because this like I love my girlfriend. I really care about her, and I really want to impress her. And meeting her friends, which are very important to her, and when she talks about them, like I'm kind of jealous too, that like she has like these wonderful friends that like are very close with her and make her happy. So having all that and being like, okay, I want to be like the best boyfriend ever, and I also want to vibe with her friends. I want her friends to like me as well. So then I make the best impression. And then because of that, there's also this insecurity which I attached, which I didn't realize, which was I made the situation a pass or fail kind of thing. I made it like a kind of challenge where it's like, um, I said this, like either two outcomes are possible. Outcome A, her friends like me, then that's great. Or outcome B is her friends don't like me, and that means I'm a fraud. She's gonna break up, and then I started catastrophizing. So then I had like this, like cognitive distortion, which I wasn't even aware of at the time, and I had all of that, and then plus I think I was comparing myself to them in the sense that they're because they're older than I am, and it seems like they have their careers going, their relationships are in order, they have their own house, and it was like a beautiful place, and it felt like a very very mature adult party, which I'm not used to. So I think just the whole time it was this whole comparison thing, and because of how everything was, and if it felt like I've never done this before, I'm not sure if this is me, I'm not sure how to act, and usually I'm like everyone has a little bit of a degree of social awkwardness, and because when I see that, then it makes me feel comfortable, and I didn't feel that at all. And on top of that, you know, these people I would deem as like high status people. So it was I was comparing myself to them the whole time, and I put all this weight on this interaction where if I don't perform to my own standards, that means that I'm an imposter, and that means that everything's going to end because I've been exposed as a fraud. And that feeling was something that was huge with my social anxiety, which I was when I was socially anxious and I was afraid of interacting with people. The main concern was the reason why I was very quiet was I had nothing interesting to say, that I would ruin whatever moment it was. So don't. My mind was telling me, do not, don't like bring anything up unless it's funny, unless it adds some like it was like relevant to the conversation and makes the conversation better. And also that means don't talk about the things you want to talk about. Focus on what the other person talks about and let them lead the conversation. And it's just me facilitating their conversation to whatever end they wanted. Whether it's like if they wanted to complain about their day, then I would be the person they vent to. So I let them vent. If they wanted to brag about how they are, then I was the person that would give them their validation. If they wanted to be angry at someone and they wanted to play the victim, then I would also join in on them for blaming this maybe even innocent person. So I put I always put this kind of weight where what which was that I'm not worthy of my own space and I'm not worthy of contributing to this interaction. So do my best to just facilitate the interaction in the way that they're used to, in the way that they expect, in the way that they want. And that carried over naturally to that because the weight was is that if you look at every underlying thing, it was I'm not good enough for this relationship. And I didn't realize that I was thinking about that because it made me think that I'm not a good enough human being to deserve to be loved or deserve to have someone and deserve to, you know, actually, even I felt like I didn't deserve to be confident because I didn't achieve anything, that all my achievements were not. So I think all those came back within that interaction based on how much I actually really cared and how much I framed my expectations. And in fact, I twisted what my intention for the time was. My intention for that event was not to have a good time and not to be myself. It was my intention was to impress her friends and to impress her.
Bro, thank you so much for sharing that, man. Like I'm always so impressed by how much you're able to unpack what was going on through your thought process from an event that you go through. Like that is I don't know if you know how difficult that is for someone to do. And the fact that you were able to really shun light and even like in many cases admit to the faults that you had in that thought process is actually quite very admirable, and I appreciate you sharing that. I think what you very well defined was a well-known terminology called imposter syndrome, right? And it's something that we see being experienced more and more based on the more achievements that you stack in your life. When you start seeing yourself as someone that has earned a lot, you kind of see yourself on this mental like pedestal that could be knocked over, and you're constantly trying to protect that pedestal, right? And sometimes that results in like not even going to events. And this is something that happens a lot even in the world of celebrities. I think about people that I've met in my life that I would look up to, and sometimes I'd be disappointed after meeting them, which there's a common phrase out there that don't ever meet your idols for that reason, right? Because it shatters what your perception is. And what you highlighted there was so important, which is it's always the expectation that you draw out that results in feeling disappointed, right? It's hard to feel disappointed if you haven't given yourself that expectation. And I've had many of those situations where I'll map out exactly in my head what the day would look like. And when that doesn't happen, all of a sudden I feel this anxiety because I might slip in the first 5 minutes. Now my whole picture came crashing down of what I thought was going to happen. Believe it or not, Camille, like this goes as far as grade seven when I gave one of my first ever talks ever in my life, which was for a grade seven class. I mean, I was in that class and I was giving a presentation, and they were simply teaching us how to use Microsoft PowerPoint for the first time. And the presentation was very basic. They said, hey, we want you to get in front of the room and we just want you to introduce yourself, tell us where you're from, and tell us one interesting thing about yourself. You think it was the easiest thing in the world. But I drew this picture in my head of like, oh man, I'm gonna speak so amazingly about my story, that interesting thing that I'm putting out there. It's gonna blow their mind, and everyone's gonna want to be my friends, and all these other things. That in the first couple of minutes when I got up there, I stuttered over my own name as I was trying to say it, and I had the script in my hand, and my hands were shaking, and I was so nervous, and it ended up becoming one by far one of the most mesmerizing memory that I have in the back of my mind. I mean, it's grade 7, and I still think about it. I think about how nervous I was because I drew out this perfect image. And I used to get this even in the world of speaking. Sometimes I would speak on stage, and because I know how to present myself on stage, I come off as the person that I want to be, right? Like I know how to present myself on stage, but can I be that person when people come up and shake my hand and ask me a question that I wasn't prepared for? And because of that anxiety, when I first started my speaking career, I used to avoid doing meet and greets after. I used to wrap up my presentation and leave the event and get the heck out of there, and maybe drive faster than I should just to get further away. But it's that fear. But when you start realizing that that expectation is gone, that you're not worried about how you appear, and you're not trying to be this persona in their mind of who the perfect Mafuz is, you start realizing that you're a lot more relaxed. And it sounds like what's the most impressive thing about your story, it sounds like you were able to rewire that in real time. Like the fact that you twisted and bend your own perception and your own expectation in that given moment is one of the hardest things to do in the moment. And I want to applaud you. I think that's so difficult to do, and it's super admirable. And as you said, you had a great time. A lot of people that went through that mental battle that they have to go through in the midst of all that sometimes come out and say they had the worst time. I mean, I've experienced that in my life as well, where I've had a terrible time because the entire time I was in my head, that by the time I came out of the head, the occasion was over. So huge applause, man. The fact that you're able to do that in real time takes far more courage than someone that was able to show up with a good personality and charisma right off the bat.
Well, thank you. I think it goes. You talked about this too. I think even with the last one, which was that when you have a bad day, did you really have a bad day, or was that just one thing? Did it not go your way, and because of that, the whole day's ruined because you just couldn't shift out of that negative mindset? I think that's a super important thing for people to point out because, once you realize that, that's where it gets, very interesting because for me in the moment, despite the intensity of what I was feeling, and I was very nervous and anxious actually, with her friends, and luckily, they were very nice and accommodating, so it made it easy. I just realized, and my girlfriend as well helped a lot. I realized, oh, and one of the funniest things about that insecurity too was whenever my girlfriend would come to help me and to check up on me, I felt weak every single time. And I mean weak in the sense that, like, wow, I'm actually taking away from her experience because she's trying to check up on me, and that means I'm not good enough to take care of myself. Like, just having that intensity of how, like, stupid and not productive and actually damaging those thoughts are, and to deal with them in real time is what we keep talking about. We keep talking about that you have to facilitate this better self-talk, that you have to have this better resilience, you have to have this courage as well to do all these things. Like all of the topics we've talked about thus far have been are like paramount to the way we think in our mindset, and when we practice it over and over in time, it becomes easier, right? Whereas before, if I was 10 years younger and I went through that same experience and felt that same intensity, my actual strategy would be to like run away. And if I didn't have a ride, which was the case this time, then I would escape somehow. Whether it would be taking extra long in the washroom just to escape and whatever. There were some times in house parties where I was invited to where I would walk to a pizzeria and just order some pizzas and come back and be like, oh yeah, I was ordering pizza because I thought people would be hungry. Like, I do like these extra strategies, but what I found really helpful was the most important thing everyone talks about. The first step is awareness. So once you're aware of that stuff, and the fact that I'm able to unpack that is just as a result of me being aware. And we talked about journaling a lot too, where, if you can't have your mind go in one direction and you don't have anyone to talk to, it's because, like you said as well, you can't, your mind never really finishes a thought, and it's very bad at doing that. So once you have a direction, i.e. talking to someone, or i.e. writing it down, it becomes easier. So over time, with practicing all these like little techniques that we talk about, and actually like being like, okay, next social interaction or next time this happens, I'm going to try this little thing. Not overwhelming, not trying to do everything at once, because you're not going to remember. Just like setting little goals and working towards each little one makes it so much easier. And I think the better courage does come in the fact of, for one, putting yourself in the situation, but then there's also a second piece that goes in. Once you're in the situation, then your natural tendency is to, if you are afraid, to make yourself invisible, or to do things to make it as comfortable as possible. When really, if you do the opposite, you'll be surprised at how much easier it is. And I mean that I I am when I'm afraid or nervous, I try to purposely make myself uncomfortable. And what I mean by that is I add my own personality quirks to whatever the conversation piece is, or I, like tell myself to say something silly, or even when I'm meeting a person for the first time and you want to present the best version of yourself, best impression. Sometimes I'll even throw a swear word, which it doesn't make sense to throw in a swear word, just to like at least kind of break down that the politeness barrier kind of thing, and also because I think it's stupid to do, and I think it's gonna make the situation worse, and it makes me more uncomfortable by doing it. Possibly the other person too, but the fact that I'm putting myself out there and at least trying these things and then somehow surviving them works. So it's funny that our tendency is to try to make the situation more comfortable, but I would argue if you do it in a safe way, of course, and make the situation a little bit more uncomfortable, it makes it easier to kind of overcome those feelings.
Yeah, because sometimes when you're trying to play the game of I need to make the situation more comfortable, you're becoming more tactical and you're spending more time in your head thinking like, I gotta agree with this person. They made a joke. I gotta laugh or add on to that joke. Like you're actually being less like yourself. Thus, the irony is you're actually becoming more uncomfortable in the midst of trying to make things more comfortable. But what you and I are pointing out here is also important to note. And it takes me back to what I said at the very beginning, which is it happens to everybody. And even the stories that you and I are sharing, it's showing that although we have a podcast show that talks about mindset, we're definitely not perfect at it. And I'm so thrilled that we get to come back here and share failure stories just as much as success stories because we're learning along the way. Even the example that you just pulled out that I talked about last week, which is why let one moment ruin your entire day. Priya, my girlfriend, actually listens to all our episodes, and she threw that back in my face one day because I was failing that by my own saying. She heard me say it on the episode, and I came out of a bad meeting and I was in a really bad mood, and we had a date night right after. And while we were on our date and driving, she could tell that I was like not in the right headspace because I was really upset about the meeting. And she threw that in my face, and I was like, "You need to knock that off right now." Like I knew deep down she was right, but and then what was interesting is that I was bothered by the fact that she's throwing my own line in my face. But then we laughed about it, and then it got better. And then I actually even told her, I was like, "See, like I'm not even perfect at it. Just because I say it doesn't mean I know how to do it all the time. It's just the realization." And it followed up by me also realizing something that's really important, which is a lot of the things that you and I throw out there I actually use our content as reminders for myself. I go back to our content to remind myself that, hey, I said this at my high so that I could revisit it on my low. When I'm not feeling great, I can go back and saying, oh, yeah, the Mafuz with the right headspace suggested I do this, or Camille in the right experience is suggested I do this. And I bring that in, which is why, in many ways, this podcast show is a library of chapters that you go through to figure out which one you need at that time. And I'm very grateful we have that. But it's important to realize that there isn't perfection in this process. It's about practicing, and as you suggest, try something new each time, and really see if you can navigate through it differently and allow the outcomes to speak volumes to you. The other part that's also really important to note here is the rewiring that's necessary. You and I talk about this in private, and maybe we brought it up in past chapters as well, but the self-talk that you need to have around your own self-confidence. I say that many times, at least 100 times in my lifetime. I say that everything falls in place when you focus on working on yourself. And part of that means working on yourself in the conversations that you have with yourself. Relationships in the past where you might have said like, "Ben, I got lucky to be in this relationship," or "Oh man, I don't deserve her," as you saw that thought process creeping back to you in that situation that you were in. But what you and I know that we've talked about a lot, and I know that you have this mindset very strongly now versus how you used to before, is the fact that you worked on yourself so much that you deserve this relationship and you earned it. You're the type of person that deserves this relationship, and that automatically makes you act in a different way and actually counterbalances and counterattacks that imposter syndrome that we were chatting about earlier. So when you start working on yourself, and I mean working on yourself can be defined at anything, right? It could be working on your social skills, working on your mindset, working on your physical appearance, working on the way you dress, working on the way you show up, working on your positive attitude, working on not complaining, whatever it is. The more you work on yourself, the better your mind feels about you because your mind has witnessed it, right? You have witnessed the work that you've put in, and it allows you to say, "I deserve this," because you know the amount of work you put in. Where others might say you got lucky because they don't see the work, you know deep down that you have. And the more you start believing that voice, the easier it is to navigate through uneasy waters like you and I both had to do in our examples that we shared today.
It becomes so easy to forget who you are sometimes that at least revisiting and like you said several times, to stop and smell the roses, to look back on your achievements and your victories does bring that back to the forefront where you feel like you earned this and you deserve it, because the truth is you have, and everything you've done has led you up to this point. You could say that about anything, but it is true. Once you actually like break it down and take a good look at that and yourself, you can see that you are in this position as a result of every situation that has happened. So naturally, you've earned it. Even if you didn't do the best, if you can find some good takeaway, which you can out of anything, any good lesson you can find does help you realize that. And you know what? I think a good example to bring up too is when it comes to courage, a lot of people will play video games and then realize that, why is this a waste of time for me? And some people it isn't, because it can be their sense of it can be their income, it can be their sense of community, and whatever. And sometimes it is good to relax and de-stress through that way, depending if you do it in a healthy way. But what a lot of people that are depressed and they turn to video games as a way to escape, what I find was the case for me especially was that there was this kind of, it's kind of weird because in the video game it's so easy to be courageous because you're not the one doing anything and there's no consequence to your actions. So naturally, well, the consequences are so minor because they don't like they you're here and you're playing the thing over there. And what I find is you build up this character in the video game to be huge or whatever, especially if you play any role-playing games, the World of Warcraft or any of those online ones where you spend hours and hours on this character, and then at the end of the day you realize you've accomplished so much with this character, but when you go back to your real life you realize that you can't really do too much with that. And that's what makes it hard, because you're like, it makes it even more challenging when it comes to depression, because you're like, I've achieved so much, and to other people it's minuscule because to them they can't really benefit from whatever you've achieved because it was in a virtual world. Whereas if you do it here, then at least in whatever challenges you faced and overcome, then you have some takeaway, whether it's being more social, whether it's being more warm, whether it's being having some new kind of advice, and you have this kind of triumph from all these challenges that you faced here, where it actually builds confidence, where in this virtual world it doesn't necessarily seem to be the case, because you can't bring back the spoils of your victories to show other people. You can in game, but at least with this, when you work on yourself, that's what makes it possible for you to build that confidence, is because you can actually show the results, which is you. And I just want to point it out because I know that like majority of people now play video games, and even for myself, it was the case where like it was so easy to get even more depressed playing video games, just because it's like, what? Why am I doing all this work for? And then you realize, you go back to real life, and then you say the same thing when really it's completely different. It's just naturally the the amount of work you put in into one thing can outweigh the other, and then you just translate to both. Why am I not getting the outcomes I'm getting in game versus doing them in real life? Because they're a lot slower, and you don't see, the 5, 10, maybe 15 steps when it comes to days, weeks, months, years down the road, what the results can be from that. Where in video games you kind of see it instantaneously. And it's good just to point out for people that are watching this, and people that tend to be addicted to video games, or people that are socially anxious, tend to like go and escape through video games. So I know it was the case for me, and that's why I wanted to bring that up, because it is super important if you want to build that courage, and you want to build that self-esteem, and that kind of confidence, that you take on these challenges in real life. And just because you cannot see the fruits of your labor, and even you can argue with my situation, which happened 2 weeks ago, when really the whole anxiety at its peak was 10 years ago, and yet I still felt it like 2 weeks ago, like literally just 2 weeks ago, after 10 years of work. But I was able to bounce back from it a lot more quickly, and still enjoy myself, and still have a great time, and still make a good impression. So the point is even though you may still have those feelings creep up, it doesn't mean that you're a failure. It means that this is another challenge to overcome, and because you had the courage to face it, you're able to become even better at it.
I absolutely love that video game analogy, and I was smiling that the video watchers can really appreciate the smile that I had the entire time as you were explaining that, because it's such a good perspective, man. Like you're really, for your character to get better and stronger, it has to go through those challenges too, right? And you think about how that, I gotta tell you, the saddest feeling is when the game ends and you know that you really put all that work for nothing, and now the character is gone, and then you have to start over. Or as the video game lovers, the video game developers are really happy with, is the fact that you go and buy the next edition and the next edition, so you stay in that never-ending escape, which is sad, but at the same time, a great analogy that I love that you brought up here. Um, Interestingly enough, the more I'm thinking about the point of where the courage really needs to follow through, is I don't think it's necessarily even in the areas of execution, because as you said it, like, you don't have to get it perfect. I really think the level of courage gets tested whether or not you decide to show up. And I think showing up is really what matters most, because it's better to show up and fail than not to show up at all, right? Even if you show up and had a miserable time, while we're on the topic of social gatherings, like let's say you go up to you go out to like a networking event, or you go out to like a bar and you're trying to meet someone, you're trying to connect with other singles, and it doesn't work out. It didn't work well. You still have things to pick up. You can analyze why it didn't go right. You can give yourself, as you said, like, hey, try something new next time. You can give yourself a new add-on and saying, hey, next time I'm going to try doing it this way, or I'm going to try speaking to one additional person, or I'm going to bring someone with me. Like, you can kind of start thinking about how to do things differently based on your past experiences. And, a lot of the things that I talk about, even when I started with saying, hey, like, research to see what the risk is, it's very historic, right? You're really relying on historic data to determine whether or not you take that leap. Well, experiences, even failed ones, give you new historic data that you can look back on the next time you jump in. And not only does it give you more courage to take that action, it also makes you better. And the ones that are most memorable, the best memories in our life, as you and I have done activities on this podcast show where we've asked each other, like, hey, what memory would you revisit twice? And you and I both outlined a memory that we both said that it came out of a struggle, right? How we're able to become victorious from an area of struggle is the fact that we got better. And the fact that it was that moment that we chose to be our favorite moment, it comes out of the beauty of actually going through it, sucking at first, and then getting better, and then becoming the gold medal winner that we've been speaking about. And I think that's worth highlighting is showing up is really where it's at. The rest can happen. The rest is not as much about courage, but more about analytical or persistence and resilience and all these other things that matter. But I really think the courage component gets tested at that first phase. And the beautiful thing about showing up is it's very much in tandem with the point of no return. Is at that moment that you get thrown this mental gate that you have the ability to decide if you're going to walk away from the gate or if you're actually going to try to climb it. And if you climb it and fail and hurt yourself, the next time you know how to climb it differently. So I think there's a big asterisk that I'm even realizing right now is in those moments in my life, I think a lot of it has to do with that. And then on the other side, it's about how you're appearing to other people, right? A lot of the moments in my life where I think that I didn't come out on the winning side when it comes to having courage or not. I think it came down to the fact that I caved based on perception of other people. I really cared how other people thought of me, and as a result of that, I acted in a way that they would have wanted me to act into until, as I mentioned earlier, I got to that point where unhappiness surpassed my expectation of anything. Like at that point, it was above anything else. This is why I really think that experiences like heartbreak and failure and disconnects and even banishment in some situations are not always a terrible thing. If you really spend time picking up everything that came out of that, as we say, these are bad experiences, and bad experiences don't only have bad things, right? When you start picking up the good things that came out of those bad experiences, it really arms you for the next time to follow through with it, and you get more courageous. But I think what's also important to know, Camille, is you have to also guard that sensitive thing that we call ego every step of the way, because the second that ego starts getting scarred, it starts becoming very difficult to follow through the courage next time. Not only does it make it more difficult to repeat that same activity because it didn't go well last time, but it's more likely to make its way into other activities in your life because now you have that historic data of how it felt to really feel bad in a situation that didn't work out. So I think that part is also important. And maybe this is something we can talk a little bit about, which is how to nurture that side of you, that egotistic side that sometimes prevents you from bouncing back when things don't show up and be courageous the next time, because we know that ego can be the enemy of courage, especially when things are going horrific on any given day.
Yeah, I find with ego too, like I find more and more detaching from it is becoming very beneficial to me. I mean, in the sense that like I'm able to be more happy about whatever happens and be more at peace with it. And I think that gives me that sense of strength, even though that can be a label. But that sense of peace as well, that feeling, it lingers when I hold that. And you're so right. Where whenever I felt like my ego was being attacked, and that came from, for instance, like even with the experience I just shared like 2 weeks ago, when that happened, I'm like, my ego was shattered. My ego was telling me that, wow, really, you put 10 years of work and you're still at this? Like, it was so easy to just give into that. And when I found that, like, letting go of that and not having that identity that I wanted, which was a strong, resilient, social person that is worthy of being like, the worthy of being loved is not the identity piece, but it is like something that's inherent to all of us because we're, as individuals, we all have something to contribute and we do have inherent value. But the point was these other things, which was like I'm this hard worker that has like gone through a lot. I've done a lot of work on myself. I'm stable, all those kind of things. Like it, my whole um, my whole performance was based on that. If I wasn't in line with that, then it became a failure. And then, ego is so tricky in the sense that it convinces you for the reason why it's right, and you think it's logic because it's all emotional. It's wrapped in so much emotion with how your mind goes. And I love how the Vedic psychology perspective on how the mind works is that, or who you are, as it views your mind and your ego as two separate things. And what your ego does is it recruits your mind to create reasons why it feels the way it does. And what that could be is something along the lines of, this challenge is not worthy, like this experience is not worthy, or this person clearly did something to purposely sabotage me, or I'm tired or whatever, or even like, this is not worthy of my time, so don't even bother going to this event. Like, it can create so many reasons that you think are logical because, like you even described, that it's just good at like making very good arguments for why you shouldn't do the things you want to do, or why you should feel like betrayed or a victim or whatever. And at the end of the day, what that does is it just creates avoidance and doesn't open you up to the lessons, because it's always placing the blame on other people, not taking responsibility for your part in it. And I think in terms of ego, when you're able to like separate yourself from that and not be able to put all this all these labels that create your identity towards that, then you don't have an outcome to expect. Then you're like, then instead of thinking you're a smart guy, when you say something, then your mind will be like, was that a smart thing to say, or was that a dumb thing to say? That was a dumb thing to say. Well, shit. Now my ego's hurt. It's like, well, it was a dumb thing to say because this guy clearly wasn't listening well and wasn't asking me questions why I said that, and just laughed it off. So that was a dumb thing, or maybe it was a dumb thing to say because people laughed, and then you became insecure. It becomes like all these stupid reasons, and then maybe for the smart thing, then you reaffirm your ego. But what does that do besides give you that feeling of, I'm right, I'm smart? It really doesn't do much, because you focus your mind on either like confirming who you are, or getting misrepresented. And you can even turn it onto yourself and being like, you know what, my whole life I thought I was smart, but it turns out I was dumb because I said a dumb thing at a party. And it sounds silly now, but in the moment it can sound completely true. And so when it comes to having like courage surrounding the ego, sometimes I think we've talked about this before in the podcast, but one of my biggest challenges in the past 3 months was letting go of this life story I built for myself. And why that was so hard to let go of was because I was afraid of who I would be without that. And in the same sense that it felt like I was dying, like some sort of spiritual death. And I think it in the same terms of whatever you're going through, and if you have that identity, it is a kind of death if you think about it. Like if you think of yourself, again, bringing up that example, as smart, and they say something dumb, then you feel like you're dying because you're not smart. And who is this dumb person that that was fooling me into thinking they've been smart the whole time? Am I been this naive? And then that creates like a whole rabbit hole, which doesn't give you the benefit of, like you said, those lessons of looking for the good and bad things. And you're not able to build up your character because of that. It's a very difficult thing to like actually like nail down on how to deal with ego. But I'm wondering if you have any thoughts around ego and how to deal with it.
There's a terrifying thought that I'm having in my head as you're explaining that exercise that you did, which is like the feeling of anxiety and uncertainty that you feel when you don't actually know where you belong in this world, right? And part of that is like, let's say you were disconnected and you're like, am I actually a smart person or a stupid person? And then you're putting out stuff into the world every day for validation of where you belong, and trying to sell yourself that you're in a better space, and not realizing that sometimes the ways that you're going about it might be the most toxic ways possible for you and for the relationships with other people. On a very surface and relatable scale, we all kind of know that when we're driving around, we have this like insane moment and like an unexplainable situation where we're able to drive home without actually paying attention to the road. We're kind of in our head, and then we open our eyes and we're like, oh my god, I'm home. And you always get shocked by it, and you find out that everyone goes through that. And that is a real thing that happens in our head, but it doesn't just end at driving home, right? It's just the other areas are not as easy to spot because you're not physically moving from a destination to another. One of them being the fact that you're killing yourself on the inside by the stories that you're telling yourself on autopilot and not even realizing that you're doing it. And in those scenarios, I've experienced this with weight gain. I've experienced this with bad habits. I've experienced this with how I started communicating and my confidence in social areas. And I never realized that that was happening while it was happening. I didn't realize I was eating junk food. I didn't realize that I was having bad day-to-day habits. I didn't realize that I was turning down invitations for outdoor activities. I didn't know I was straying away from conversations when I go out to social gatherings. I was just comfortably floating in my comfort level, and in the same time I was telling myself the story that it was actually the right path. And that part, I believe, operates in a very similar way as how on autopilot we can drive home every single day. So that first part is really about, I think, that self-awareness is, do you actually know how you are being perceived by this world, or are you absolutely delusional and you think you're going about it the right way? Like, imagine someone who says, I'm the nicest person in the world, and is treating everyone like crap. Or the ones that are will say the most obnoxious and incorrect things in the world, but in their mind they think they're a genius, right? Like, it's out there, and it might even be us, which is kind of scary if you think about it. Like, do we actually know? So I think that self-awareness component is important, just to kind of see where you stand in how you see yourself, and that can actually be measured if you're paying attention to the right signs. In the example that I used about maybe being obnoxious, you can actually measure that based on your relationship with others and how they're responding to you and the feedback that you get. But there's also ability for you to spend some time in your head asking yourself, is the conversations that I'm going guiding me the right way? I would have been able to pay attention to the fact that I put on a lot of weight if I was more aware, right? I would have been able to pay attention to the fact that I'm not as confident based on how my interactions go if I did a retrospective and paid attention to how it went. So there are abilities to pay attention to that. But I think it starts with that. And then the second part, which I can't emphasize enough, and I think I've emphasized it in at least half of our chapters, which is surrounding yourself with good people. Because the good people will make you aware when you're screwing up. Because they don't, if they're really good people, they want to see you win. And if they want to see you win, it sometimes starts with the tough conversations that you're losing. And those needs to be brought up. And those are sometimes difficult to bring up unless someone is willing to do it. I've seen situations in the past where I was torn. I was like, do I say something to this person? And I realized that the fear is the fact that I was worried that I would never have that same relationship with that person. But the courage is being able to speak up and actually let them know. And I hope the same for my friends. And I like to think I've surrounded myself with very optimistic yet blunt individuals that will very much put me in place if things get out of line. So from that perspective, I think there's a huge piece of this. Going back to Jim Collins' book of Good to Great, there's a component that he talks about that is one of the biggest parts of the book. At least I think it will be, because of the fact that it's been highlighted as one of the things that shocked him the most during the study of the commonalities of people that go from good to great. And he talked about something that's called level 5 leadership. And level 5 leadership is a level that is very difficult to get to. But the good news is, as he suggests based on his study, that it's possible for everyone to do it. It's that there's a commonality that the ones that go from good to great are considered level 5 leaders. And what that looks like are individuals that are, once again, pulling from two different extremities. One extremity is having the humility that the work that they're doing isn't actually for them, but it's for the better good, for a bigger cause. And what that means is sometimes building your entire career and not caring if you get the credit. As a matter of fact, when they were doing the research and studying and having conversations, what they would find these CEOs do is that they would actually, like, every answer would come back to the team, or even luck, or these other reasons of why they were able to go from 0 to 100 real quick. But when it came to like what they contributed, they would always stray away or shy away from answering that question. And they would have said things like, oh, I'm just lucky that I had a great board of advisors, or I'm lucky that my team allowed me to do it. It's like, oh, if you saw behind the curtain, you wouldn't be giving me the credit. Like, they would joke about it almost like dismissively because they didn't want the credit, and they didn't care for that because they had the humility that the mission was bigger than actually getting their own attention. As a matter of fact, there's a correlation with the opposite, those that go from great to good. And you can actually see that the CEOs of that business are the one that wants to put the spotlight on themselves, that are actually out there to get their name out there. And they used an example of a leader that was running Chrysler once upon a time, and there was this big movement of the fact that he got so much popularity that he kept coming back from retirement because he still wanted to keep getting credit for Chrysler's credit. And interestingly enough, I'm just trying to think of the acronym here, but it's his name had like his name has 5 letters, and I can't remember what it was, but people in the team were joking about the fact that it stood for something like all will be CEO of Chrysler always. Like it was something like that, and like they started joking that that was his name because he kept coming back from retirement. And so you kind of think about like the commonalities of that. So that's one side of the extremity, which is not willing to do whatever it takes for a bigger cause and not caring if you get credit for it. The second side is actually quite the opposite. You're a savage, which means you're willing to do whatever it takes to ensure that that mission gets met. And sometimes what that willingness means is like firing someone that's in your family because it doesn't serve your mission. Not caring, being able to do the hard things that others wouldn't do, which takes a lot of courage to do, right? And I think this ties in with that piece as well, which is you now know your mission. You know the mission isn't about you. It's more about the fact that you need to do it for the world. And now you're working your butt off and doing whatever it takes to get there, even if it means cutting some ties along the way. And that level of humility with that willingness and discipline to push it all the way really is what started creating level 5, because the mentality that level 5 leaders have is that they want to build something that outlasts them. Where level 4 leaders, although they could be great leaders, they want the feeling that when they leave, the business crashed and burned. They want the feeling that their people are begging them to come back because they know that they weren't able to do this. And one thing that Jim Collins did a really good job highlighting in this book is he's like, I hope this isn't seen just as a business book, because I also think about this ambition that we have in life. Because when you're making decisions based on you wanting to get the credit or what matters to you, you're going to make a lot of biased decisions that benefit you or for the ego stroke that you're hoping to get from the decisions that you make, thus limiting you from becoming great. And that made a lot of sense to me when you realize that for you to really be great, the mission needs to exceed past that feeling of the good feeling that you get because you were the one that did it. And, that was a good realization for me. And I'm really excited to dive into future chapters and understand that better. But I have to tell you, that perspective got me mighty curious and really made me want to bring that up in today's conversation around courage, because I really think there's an opportunity for every single one of us, whether we're good or not even good, to go into a level of great. And I think it starts with that level of the humility of working towards something that's bigger than you getting credit, and the willingness to do whatever it takes to get there. And I think there's a beautiful battle of courage and humility happening there.
It's funny when you say it like that too. I think instantly to being intention, like what your intention is for whatever you're gonna do, and what your focus is based on. Because, for instance, if your intention, like let's say again, to put yourself in a situation that is hard for you, whatever that could be. Let's throw the social one again, and your goal is to be like interesting. Then that's what you're going to focus on, instead of making it something greater than yourself, which is to have a good time. And what having a good time means is making sure everyone has a good time. And because by natural virtue of being fun and in the moment, you're extending that, ensuring that with the people around you. And by doing so, you don't crumble if it doesn't work out. Like if you make, let's say in that case, the company, if your identity is just that company, or if your experience is just based on whatever label you attach yourself, whether it's smart, interesting, or whatever, and it doesn't work out, then you absolutely crumble, and there's nothing there, and it becomes very, very difficult to bounce back from that. Whereas, like what you're saying in that book, it describes was like that you want to not really sacrifice yourself, but not even not even put so much weight on whatever it is you want to prove, because really you're not trying to prove anything. You're submitting the best that you can to whatever it is out there. You're putting yourself there and not caring about the outcome, and that comes from not caring about receiving the credit for it, or even just not telling yourself that, like, acknowledging the other people that are also part of it. And I like that is super good for ego, but I imagine that's really good for even courage itself, because then you shift your focus from yourself onto the situation. And what that could mean is that you're able to focus on the actions necessary, as opposed to focus on whatever it is to prove yourself right. And then you look for the evidence in the moment, and then you create all these like different things which aren't helpful at all, because then you start looking like, if I said that joke and no one laughed, that means that I ruined it, or that I'm not fun, or I'm not like contributing at all. And then it becomes into this vicious cycle that you're feeding your own self with these thoughts of, this is evidence for why this is not working, this is whatever, or this is not a good time, and just builds up this whole thing and doesn't create that full courage, which comes essentially from what we keep talking about. The confidence comes from trusting yourself, to put yourself in that situation and being okay with whatever happens. Like, that's where the real confidence and courage comes from. And it's so difficult to cultivate, because like half the time, like, it took me forever to realize what being yourself actually means. And I would say that's it. I had a huge issue, like I said, like 3 months ago, trying to change the story of who I am, which was my limiting thing, because I put all these labels and I attached myself, and I became really depressed whenever things became difficult for me, or I had to put effort, because that naturally meant that I'm not smart, or I'm not worthy of whatever gifts I have, or whatever goals I want to achieve. Where as soon as I start realizing that, I can trust myself, and I am actually more capable than I think, that's what actually allowed me to perform better. Just by virtue of, one, I have a lot more energy now that I'm not overthinking everything I'm doing, because I'm not focusing on the wrong things. I'm focusing on my core value and my intention, what I want to give into the situation, not what I want to take from it. And also realizing that, I also have a say in whatever happens, and I also need to be the person that I guess not really benefits, but that does take away from the experience itself. Where, you're meeting a new person, it's like, the thought is always, does this person like me? Does this person like me? But the more powerful thing is like, do I also like this person? Because that's also a huge part of the equation. So I think having that natural balance is huge, and kind of facilitates that growth within your character, and gives you that trust in yourself, which I find is lacking in a lot of people, especially people that are like type A, or like anxious or depressed people as well. It's like, you see yourself as unworthy, or you see yourself as like, this is bound to go wrong, and it's almost like you have to make the challenge smaller rather than building yourself up. And that always, I don't think that gives real confidence or real courage. I think that's why, like, we don't like people that cheat on tests, because they're not actually worthy of passing the test. What they did is they made the test easier because they cheated in whatever way. And I think that naturally extends to real life too. When you do things like make whatever challenges you're trying to get easier without actually putting the work in yourself, that's where you're kind of shorthanding yourself and not able to build as much confidence as you would. And maybe it is worth bringing up that it's not always the case, and there is something to be said about researching ahead of time to make the challenge a little bit easier. So, you don't go on a 4-hour hike without any water, because that would be silly. But I think when we're talking about this, it's also important to realize that at the very root of it, it is growing yourself and building yourself up to rise to the occasion.
Yeah, and to your point about bringing water for a 4-hour hike or cheating on a test, like, it needs to be objective driven. right? If you're going to write the test for the sake of learning so that you could do better maybe in the next year's class or a difficult class or real life situation, and you're cheating, you're not guessing getting that objective. Where in the same manner, if you're trying to do that 4 hour walk and you know you're doing it to get the exercise and you want to make sure that the water allows you to get the maximum effort, or maybe you're trying to get to the peak of a mountain and you're not able to without water. When you're objective driven, the things that you're bringing can be either seen as tools or cheats, right? And the tools, I think, is where it's worth looking into. I remember that I was watching a conversation between two people that I know, and one of them was talking about how she got scammed, and she was talking about the fact that it was like an online scam that worked on her. And the other person that was speaking, he said something that I loved. He said, "You only get scammed when you try taking shortcuts." And I thought that was so well put, right? Like the scams happen when you're trying to find a shortcut of a faster way to get there. And I think that to me didn't just end at like the shortcut of like what she was trying to achieve, but rather the shortcut of anything that you try to get out of life, right? When you try taking shortcuts, you're getting scammed. And although it might not look like some guy from Nigeria snuck in an email and took money out of you, it's still you're getting scammed from other things that you could have acquired based on that experience. And I think in many ways, like one of the worst things you could do to yourself is rob your own experience, right? Rob your own experience. And I don't care if the experience ends with a happy ending or a failure story, but robbing yourself of the experience is worse than anything else. It's almost like you might as well have slept through a movie and never watch that movie again. You'll never know what that story is, or be in the loop when people are doing inside jokes about the movie. Like the amount of Squid Game reference that I've seen. I was fortunate that I watched Squid Games when I was out in Vancouver, so I was in the loop. But I know so many people that felt like they needed to watch it just because of the fact that they felt out of the loop. But it's like but if you didn't get that experience, you're out of the loop, right? And I think that that's important to note beyond Squid Games. Like that literally applies to every other area. The last thing I wanted to just touch on really quickly that I thought about while you were explaining your perspective there was the idea of the hierarchies that we create in our head, right? And I like what you asked, which is like, not only are you right for them, but are they right for you, right? And I think that's worth thinking about in every area of life. We commonly see this thing in the world of employment. When people are walking into a job interview, the hierarchy and the setting is made to say like, oh man, I hope they think I'm good enough. But I think there's a huge opportunity. When we think about modern mindset, we're in a modern world now where you have the ability to ask yourself, is this job the right fit for me? Right. And the fact that you can actually ask the interviewer questions about his or her experience in the job to determine whether or not it's the right fit. And I think that mindset needs to be adopted better than it's ever had, because when you start having the right mindset, you're not making desperate decisions. You're not jumping at the first opportunity when there could have been better opportunities out there. You actually have, again, the courage to say no and walk away from something because you realize that it doesn't actually match your way of being, because you lose a part of yourself when you give it up to something like that job. You lose a part of yourself when you give it up to a relationship. You lose a part of yourself when you give it up to a decision that you make. So it's worth asking whether or not the right fit exists, and not taking away the hierarchy but when you're saying, I hope I get accepted or I hope I'm good enough, you're automatically positioning the other party as the higher party. You're granting their approval. You're granting their acceptance, and you're hoping that if you get accepted, that you have better opportunities. But I think the mental shift of seeing yourself on a level playing field will really allow you to take away those expectations and the fear that comes with it. And naturally, that feeling of courage that you have to make the tough decisions. Just before you and I started recording, I was telling you about a speaking event that I turned down recently. And I told you that it made me feel empowered. And I'll tell you another story that made me feel really empowered. And I'll tell you why. In my career of speaking on stage, Camille, there's only one talk that I've ever done in my life that I absolutely bombed on. Absolutely bombed on. And it was a comedy skit that I was asked to do on stage where I just didn't, I wasn't able to follow through on it, and I did terrible. And I remember it scarred me so bad. And I asked myself, why on earth did I say yes to it? Only to realize that it never was something that benefited me in any way. In fact, the subject matter wasn't even my subject matter. I just said yes because to me it sounded like an opportunity, not even knowing what the benefit of that event was. And since then, I've really been working towards the idea of saying no to things that doesn't align with my core beliefs or just gives me a bad gut feeling that it's not the right feeling. When we talked about intuition a couple chapters ago, when the intuition tells me otherwise, having the courage to say no is also important. And I was recently reached out to by a well-known brand that wanted me to be a brand partner, and it was for a consumer good, and their spokesperson is one of the biggest soccer players in the world, right? And so, like, to me, there was some appeal there on top of the fact that they were offering a good sum of money. But as tempted as I was, it took me a couple of days to get back to them because the offer was kind of like, at first it sounded great, but the realization that it was so out of my element, like this isn't something that I believed in. I didn't believe in the product, and it wasn't me. When you talk about being yourself, like it wasn't me of what they wanted me to do with the product. So I had to go back and give them a hard no, and they actually were like shocked that I would turn down such a good offer. But I gotta tell you, I felt empowered because at those moments of saying no to that event and knowing to that no to that brand opportunity, I feel like I finally built up the courage to turn down things and follow through with my commitment of saying no to the things that don't match my core beliefs. Because it wasn't easy, man. There was some opportunities that I would get that even though I was like, I'm gonna start saying no, I would cave because I would feel bad or I would think I'm losing out. I had the fear of losing out or the fear of missing out. And as a result of that, I would say yes and go against my own rule. When I started saying no, the courage that it took to even turn down things that aren't the right fit, I think is a beautiful feeling. And it gives you full control over the fact that you truly are wanting to be who you say you want to be. And it lets you chase after the things that you really want to chase. So I think that when it comes to courage, it's equally as important to talk about the courage to walk away from things as it is about following through with things as well.
I find a lot of people, myself included, like suffer from this kind of feeling of trying to fit into life rather than trying to make life fit into you. And I mean that goes in like so many aspects where we go into a job that we hate, or we're in friendships that we don't care about, or we're in toxic relationships, or we have all these different things, and it's a result of us wanting to fit into life and being like, well, this is the way it is. This is my expectation of what life is supposed to be, and this is just the entry to it. And maybe it'll get better, and we make up all these excuses. But like you said, the powerful thing comes from the way you should live life, which is you make life fit into you. So you find the career you want, you find the relationship you want, you surround yourself with the right people, you have the right conversations, and it's so much harder to actually do than to say, for the reason like you said. Like, it's really hard to walk away from something that because the risk that goes in your mind is, will I what do I do? For instance, like if I leave my friends, I'll be alone, and being alone is scary. So running that risk, what does that mean, and what does that will I find worse friends, or will I be in a worse off situation if I walk away? And the answer is maybe, but at the same time, you have a good opportunity to recognize the possibility for things that can be better, and you built yourself up in a way that reaffirms that you have respect for yourself and that you have value, because you know when things are wrong and you can walk away from them, provided that you do it righteously. And like, it's a good thing you brought it up, because I didn't even think about bringing it up at all. Is like, the courage to walk away is so hard, and especially that we're expected to to act in a certain way, and when we don't, then it kind of is like, well, what's wrong with me then? If why isn't this working for me? It's worked for everyone else, and maybe I'm just complaining. Maybe I'm not being right. And at the same time too, when you are different, you feel exposed and vulnerable, and it's very hard to actually sit with that feeling. And I think part of the first steps is to actually have the courage to sit with that feeling. And I mean, the best example I'll give is when I was uh, living by myself in my apartment in Poland a year ago during the pandemic. I was having like online classes, and I was home alone after class. I had nothing to do. I had like no shows to watch. I didn't know what to do with myself. I literally had no idea what to do with myself, and I was pretty depressed. And there was one point where a podcast was playing while I was cooking, and then it ended. And when it ended, there was a silence, and for a good like 30 seconds, all of a sudden this feeling crept in. This feeling of anxiousness, like something bad is happening. And like I actually felt like palpitations. And I'm like, what the hell is going on? Like I'm here and there's nothing else that's going wrong. And it's like what I had to do is like I had to like dry my hands and then just put on something just to fill in the silence. But the courageous thing would have been to actually sit with that, because when I avoided that, I didn't listen to the lesson it was trying to give me, because that lesson came in pain and it came in this kind of fear, which is naturally what's going to happen with almost any kind of new situation. But what I had to do, and I was given this exercise, which was a very interesting one, which is I had to find a blank wall in my place, and I had to set time where I wouldn't be bothered. And my exercise was just to stare at the wall and do nothing. Just stare at it for as long as I could. And that was a very painful exercise. Like it was shocking because I felt guilt. I'm like, why am I being so unproductive right now? Why am I not working on anything? I should be studying. I should be working. I should be reading. I should be listening to a podcast that betters myself. I should be preparing food or whatever. I like all these should thoughts came, and I had this fear coming up, but I stuck with it, and having the courage just to face that uncomfortableness made it so I realized that I I was I was having all this anxiety because I felt like something needed to change. And what that something was that I was not allowing myself to have this free time of having like no stimulus, and trying to actually face my fears and face the memories that like I found traumatized me, and like it was such a painful thing to go through, but because I didn't have the courage to, it allowed me to get past them, and it allowed me to do it in a way that wasn't self-destructive, because luckily I didn't go back to old habits, which would have been like getting drunk and like or like getting high and finding other things, and those things would have been a lot worse than what I was doing. But I have to say that the courage, when we brought up the courage to walk away and the courage to actually face that anxiety, because the anxiety was that things could be a lot worse if I don't work towards them as aggressively as possible at the cost of my own energy. And I had to suppress the things about me that were uncomfortable, because the feelings were that I went through like a terrible experience that I didn't know how to manage, and that completely shook my worldview. And I had all these feelings of inadequacy, and that things are just going to get worse. And that's the same feeling I get when I had to walk away from people in my life, when I had to end relationships. It had the same feeling was there, which was that one, I didn't want to hurt the person, and that was my way of that was actually my ego trying to convince me not to do it because it would have been uncomfortable. And my ego was saying that I'm not. It was defending the fact that I wanted to be this person that never leaves a situation worse, and so I thought that I was such a good person by cutting off this person. I'd be detrimental, like adding detriment to the life because of the absence of me. And it's a weird thing to wrap your head around because it sounds so stupid when you say it out loud, but again, you can convince yourself otherwise. So for certain people, maybe that's the fear that prevents them to walk away. But then for other people, it can be that, and I still have both sides, which is that I won't find anything better, or this is the way it is, and there's something wrong with me if I choose to walk away. But if there's something in you telling you that something has to change, it's something you have to be courageous about actually facing and sitting with. And I'm actually amazed at how difficult it is to sit with that feeling, because the older I get, it seems like it's more difficult, especially that I have more things I could distract myself with, whether beneficial things like working out or even like working on something or reading, whatever. It's so easy to convince myself to distract myself and not to actually focus in on that. But I think the greatest change when it comes to building that courage is to actually face it.
It will shock you when you spend enough time witnessing how few people actually give some dedicated time to themselves for their thoughts, right? Like it's the you're absolutely right. The older that you get, the busier that you get, and the busier that you get, the more you use that as your excuse to avoid some of the things that are necessities, like actually taking time for yourself. This is why meditation has started to become a much bigger practice, because as we're entering the world of heavy consumption, we're facing a lot of challenges that maybe we weren't used to, and as a result of that, spending alone time in your own thoughts, not even socializing or doing an activity, is such a beautiful thing. And us introverts really benefited from that in the past, I think, just out of the fact that we would make time just to escape from the noise. But the fact that we can do it in an intentional way with an objective to deal with something is a beautiful thing. Camille, when you hear the words fight or flight, it's interesting because flight almost looks like the that you wussed out, that you weren't courageous and you ran away from the situation rather than fighting it. But what you've identified and what I talked about with the courage of walking away very much highlights that the fight or flight both are equally as courageous if it's done for the right intentions and done for the right objectives. So it's a great perspective where it's not about whether you deal with the problem or run away from the problem. I think of it as almost like a sports team that has offense and defense. Both are necessary to win the game, and not it doesn't make one more higher of importance than the other one. Both are absolutely necessities to win the game, and I think having the courage to be able to deal with both sides, the offense and the defense, I think is equally as important. Camille, as we wrap up, I'm going to leave you with a fun fact, something that I've been learning about in some of my research for some brand strategies that I'm working on, is the beauty of an animal that we don't talk about enough, which is the bison. And I learned through my research that bison is the only animal in the world that when there's a storm, it actually charges the storm rather than run away from it. It is actually the only animal in the world that does that. So what it does is, without any thought, with instant instinct, it turns around and charges it, hope in hopes to put that thing away. And I hope with our listeners today leave with that same mindset. We're going to call it the bison mindset, where whatever storm is happening in your life, I hope that you charge it full frontal and you know that you can take it down. Use any terminology you want, whether it's feel the fear and do it anyways, or any other terminologies that we shared. I hope more than anything else that our listeners takes a giant leap of faith. I don't know if you saw one of the recent posts on the Modern Mindset Instagram account, Camille, but it was a beautiful comparison of being in your comfort zone versus where the magic happens. And what you're going to see is the astronaut in a very, very tiny, cornered, almost like claustrophobic little planet that is sitting on, that is its comfort zone, looking out to the beautiful, unlimited universe of magic where it hopes to be one day. And the only way to get there is to take that leap of faith. And I hope that every one of our listeners, whatever it is that you're battling with that is preventing you from getting there due to fear, I encourage you to use this and us as a case study and as a resource in order to take that leap and charge at it like a bison. Camille, I want to thank you again for another incredible conversation, man. I don't know how it happens. I never, speaking of expectations, I come into these episodes with no expectations. I have a hunch that we're going to talk for a couple hours, but I leave every single time shocked. Like I just came out of a great conversation, and you've done that over and over again for every one of these 13 chapters. And I want to thank you again for joining me for chapter 13 as we move ahead in this incredible podcast show.
Yeah, thank you. I have to say you're half the equation too, so you have a huge part in that, and I feel the same way. I'm always amazed with the takeaways we find afterwards, and obviously the quotes that we get from it, they move me. So I'm grateful for that.
Hey, thank you so much. And listeners, as always, thank you for tuning in. And if you got even an ounce of value to help you build courage and really dominate the space that you're in, please do show some love and hit like if you're listening to it on a platform that allows you to hit like. Otherwise, please follow or subscribe so that you're the first to know every single time a brand new episode releases. Camille, thank you again for your time. Listeners, thank you for tuning in. And we'll see you again for chapter 14 next week. Take care, everyone.